I never wanted trouble with our HOA. I really didn't. But when I found that bright orange notice taped to my front door last Tuesday morning, I knew this was war. My hands were shaking as I read it. Immediate HOA fee increase, $500 monthly violation, excessive vehicles on property 3 cars. That's what this was about. My work truck, which I needed for my construction business. My wife's SUV, which she used for her hospital shifts. The used Honda we had just bought for our daughter's 16th birthday. 3 perfectly normal cars parked in our own driveway. I looked out through the kitchen window and saw Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, doing her usual morning inspection walk. Pink clipboard in hand, she stopped at my driveway, pulled out her phone, and started taking pictures. Again. This was the 3rd time this week. "Honey, she's out there again," my wife Sarah called from the living room. "Maybe we should just park the Honda in the garage," she suggested, worry in her voice. "No," I said firmly, pouring my coffee. "We're not hiding our daughter's car like we're doing something wrong." The garage was full, Sarah's medical supplies took up half the space, and my work equipment filled the rest. We had explained all of this at the last HOA meeting. I clenched my jaw as I remembered how Karen had smirked during that meeting, not even bothering to look up from her phone when I spoke. "Rules are rules, Mr. Thompson," she had said. "Maybe if you can't afford proper garage storage, this neighborhood isn't for you." But what Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been quietly buying up properties in our development for the past 5 years through my real estate investment company. Every time a house went up for sale, I made sure to use different LLC names for the purchases. At first, it was just a smart investment strategy, but now it had become something more. As I stepped outside to get the mail, I took my time, making sure Karen saw me. She pretended to inspect Mrs. Johnson's rose bushes while keeping an eye on me. Poor Mrs. Johnson had been fined last month for having roses that were too vibrant and disrupting the neighborhood color harmony. My phone buzzed. A text from my lawyer. "Property closing complete. You now own 67% of the development." I smiled and tucked my phone away. Karen, oblivious, power-walked toward me, her clipboard clutched to her chest. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice sickly sweet. "I trust you received our notice about the vehicle violation?" "I did, Karen, and I have some questions about the legal basis for this fee increase." I kept my voice calm and professional. She waved her hand dismissively. "The board has full authority to implement fees as needed. Perhaps if you attended more meetings, you'd understand how these things work." What she didn't know was that I had attended every single meeting for the past 5 years, through proxy representatives who owned the other houses I had purchased. I had sat back and documented every one of Karen's selective enforcements, every questionable fee, every abuse of power. As she turned to leave, her designer heels clicking on the sidewalk, she threw one final comment over her shoulder. "Oh, and the board is calling an emergency meeting tonight, 7 p.m. sharp. We'll be discussing additional measures about problem properties." I watched her walk away. Then I pulled out my phone and texted my lawyer. "Time to prepare those documents we discussed. Karen's making her move tonight." Just then, my daughter's car pulled into the driveway. Karen stopped and took more photos. My blood boiled, but I kept my cool. Tonight would change everything. But first, I had some calls to make. I went inside and spread out the property maps on my desk. Each lot was carefully highlighted and coded. 5 years of planning, 5 years of watching, 5 years of gathering evidence against Karen and her reign of HOA terror. Tonight, she would learn that her biggest mistake wasn't just targeting my family. It was underestimating exactly who she was dealing with. My phone rang. It was Mrs. Johnson crying. "They fined me again," she said between sobs. "Another $200. This time for my porch light being too bright. I just replaced the bulb, James. It's the same wattage I've used for 20 years. I clenched my jaw. "This ends tonight, Mrs. Johnson," I said. "Just be at the meeting." By 6:50 p.m., I was walking into the community center's meeting room. Tension filled the air. Every seat was occupied, neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder, whispering among themselves. Karen had outdone herself. She had even hired a professional photographer to take pictures of my driveway from different angles, making my 3 cars look like some sort of illegal parking lot. She stood at the podium, her sparkly pink gavel resting beside her. "Let's begin," she announced, tapping the gavel once. Karen had purposely scheduled this emergency meeting on a Tuesday night, knowing that most working families wouldn't be able to attend. But I had made sure to be here. I sat in the back row, watching her put on her usual performance. "As you can see from these professional photographs," she began, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation, "Mr. Thompson's property has essentially become a used car lot." A few gasps came from her loyal followers in the front row, the same ones whose Christmas decorations stayed up until March without receiving any fines. I glanced around the room. Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor, rolled her eyes. She had been fined last month because her grandson parked in her driveway while helping her repair her roof. Mr. Chen, the high school science teacher, was furiously taking notes. He had received a violation notice for parking 1 inch over his driveway line during the last snowstorm. Karen clicked to the next slide, a zoomed-in photo of my daughter's car. "This vehicle has been parked in the same spot for over 48 hours, she declared. She conveniently left out the part where my daughter had been home from college for the weekend. The meeting dragged on as Karen presented her so-called evidence. Charts showing property value decreases, fabricated. Complaints from anonymous neighbors, probably her friends. Even weather reports suggesting my cars were somehow causing excess snowdrifts on the street. Then she pulled out a thick binder. "I have documented every instance of vehicles entering and leaving Mr. Thompson's property over the past 3 months, she announced proudly. My eyebrows shot up. Karen had been tracking my family's movements. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That's when Sarah Jenkins, my next-door neighbor, stood up. "Karen, isn't this a bit excessive?" she asked. "They're just regular cars in a regular driveway." Karen's face turned bright red. "You're out of order," she snapped. "You haven't been recognized by the chair." I watched as Karen's husband, Bob, started handing out copies of a new proposed bylaw, one that would limit each household to 2 vehicles, require garage parking only. The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. Almost. Karen raised her gavel. "We will now vote on the new vehicle restrictions and fee increase," she declared. "All in favor?" That was my cue. I stood up slowly, straightening my tie. "Point of order, Madam President." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're not recognized, Mr. Thompson," I smiled. "Actually, according to HOA bylaw section 73, any property owner may raise a point of order regarding voting procedures." Silence fell over the room. Karen's perfectly manicured nails gripped the podium tighter. "Before we vote," I continued, "I believe it's important to review the HOA's current property ownership structure." I walked toward the front of the room, my shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "You see, over the past 5 years, Sunrise Properties has been acquiring homes in this development." Karen's face lost all color as I pulled out a large property map. "And as CEO of Sunrise Properties, I thought it might interest everyone to know exactly who owns the majority of this HOA." I paused, making eye contact with each board member. "But perhaps we should discuss that after we review these questionable surveillance activities Karen has been conducting." The room erupted into murmurs. Phones came out. Neighbors started recording. Karen's hand trembled as she reached for her water bottle. She knocked over her gavel. Bob rushed to her side, whispering something in her ear. Her eyes widened. She finally realized who she had been messing with all these years. I stood tall, my voice steady. Karen's smug smile was gone. I clicked open my briefcase. "Before we vote," I said, laying down a thick stack of property deeds, "I have something important to share with everyone." Each paper represented another piece of my plan coming together. Neighbors leaned forward. "For the past 5 years," I continued, "I've watched this HOA board ignore serious maintenance issues while harassing good neighbors over petty violations." I pulled up photos on the meeting room's big screen. Here's Karen measuring my grass at 3 a.m. last Tuesday. Gasps filled the room. And here she is, ignoring her friend's bright purple fence, which somehow never received a violation. Karen's face turned red. "That's not true," she screeched. "I enforce all rules fairly." Her hands shook as she grabbed her water bottle, spilling some on her designer blouse. I clicked to another slide. Here's a time-stamped video of Karen tracking my family's car movements for months. Even her supporters started shaking their heads. I looked straight at Karen. But the most interesting thing I discovered, I said, picking up the stack of deeds, is that through my company, Sunrise Properties, I now own 67% of the homes in this development. The room fell dead silent. Neighbors stared at me. Karen froze. That makes me, I said calmly, the majority owner of the HOA itself. Karen jumped up. You can't do that, she shrieked. It's not allowed. I smiled. Actually, I can. I pulled out another folder. I've had 3 different law firms review everything. It's completely legal. I set down one final document. I also have signed complaints from 32 residents about harassment, selective enforcement, and suspicious fees. The room erupted. Neighbors stood up, sharing their own horror stories. Karen banged her gavel frantically. This meeting is adjourned, she shrieked. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. I didn't even flinch. Actually, I said, gesturing at the deeds on the table, according to HOA bylaws, you need a majority vote to adjourn. I smiled. And I don't think you have that anymore. Karen froze, her hand on the doorknob. Her power was slipping away, and this was just the beginning. Karen stood frozen at the door, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling against the handle. For the first time, she was not in control. The room buzzed with murmurs. Neighbors whispered to one another, shaking their heads, sharing glances filled with realization and anger. I leaned forward, voice calm but firm. Now, I continued, flipping to another document, let's talk about those mysterious pool renovation fees from last summer. Karen's face paled. You know, I said, tapping the folder, the $50,000 in HOA funds that were supposed to be used to fix the pool? The pool that, strangely, never got fixed? A few gasps came from the crowd. Because, I added, pulling out bank records, I have here some very interesting transactions showing those funds, redirected to a certain personal bank account. The murmurs turned into full-blown outrage. Karen slumped against the wall, her once proud posture now that of a cornered animal. A local news van had just pulled into the parking lot outside. I had invited them. Karen, I said, gesturing toward the neighbors, these are the people you've been bullying for years. They're done being afraid of you. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman Karen had fined for her roses, stood up. My late husband and I saved for this home for 40 years, she said, voice shaking. Last winter, I was in the hospital with pneumonia, and they fined me $200 for not shoveling my walkway fast enough. Tears welled in her eyes. I almost lost my home because of those fines. Others joined in. Mr. Chen, the science teacher, spoke about the time he was fined for snow covering part of his mailbox. The Rodriguez family shared how they'd been harassed for having family over too often. Even Karen's own former board members admitted that she had bullied them into approving unfair rules. Karen sank into her chair, rubbing her temples. I turned to the room. I moved to dissolve the current board, effective immediately. A wave of hands shot up. I second that motion, Bob Chen from 2 doors down declared. The vote was unanimous. Karen sat in silent disbelief. For 20 years, she had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. Now, in a single night, it was over. As I gathered my documents, Karen's husband, Bob, helped her to her feet. Her face was ashen. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, she spat, voice weak. I shrugged. Actually, I said, you might be hearing from the state attorney's office first. I handed over my folders to an HOA ethics investigator I had contacted weeks ago. Karen's eyes widened. And with that, she stormed out of the meeting room. She wasn't the queen anymore. She was just another disgraced HOA president. The aftermath, a new beginning. Karen officially resigned from the HOA board the next morning, but she wasn't done trying to save face. She sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood, claiming she was being forced out by big money interests. Nobody bought it. 3 weeks later, a moving truck arrived at Karen's house. She had put her home on the market and was leaving town. Neighbors gathered in their yards to watch as she drove away, a fresh HOA violation notice stuck to her windshield, courtesy of her new neighborhood's strict parking rules. Oh, the irony. With Karen gone, we made real changes. The new HOA board included 5 residents from different parts of the neighborhood. Selective enforcement was banned. Fees were cut in half. Money was used for actual improvements, fixing the pool, upgrading the playground, and assisting elderly homeowners in need. We even turned Karen's old surveillance spot into a community garden. For the first time in decades, people actually enjoyed living here. The best part? Property values went up 15% in the first month after Karen left. Turns out people actually prefer living in a community where they're respected instead of policed. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch when my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Karen's new neighborhood watch group. We heard about what happened in your HOA. Do you have any advice for dealing with a power-hungry HOA president?" I chuckled, leaned back in my chair, and thought about how sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's showing others how to stand up for themselves.